A steady drizzle tapped against the tall windows of the old manor, the rain forming slick rivulets down the glass, as if the house itself was weeping. Inside, the air held a heavy, damp stillness, broken only by the distant ticking of a grandfather clock. The crime scene was eerily undisturbed. The locked attic, sealed from within, contained a single, lifeless body sprawled upon the wooden floor. Émile Lemoine, a reclusive yet respected scholar, now forever silenced. His face was frozen in a grotesque expression of surprise, his spectacles cracked where they had fallen beside him. Chief Inspector Lucien Moreau stood in the dimly lit attic, his keen eyes scanning every detail with the patience of a man who had seen more mysteries than he cared to count. No sign of forced entry. The only key to the attic remained in the victim's pocket. The single window was shut tight, the latch still locked from the inside. No visible wounds, no weapon, no indication of struggle. Only one thing stood out, the peculiar scent of almonds lingering in the stagnant air. Moreau knelt beside the corpse. "Poison," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. A quiet death, save for the riddle it left behind. How had someone administered poison in a locked room without entering or leaving? Sergeant Henry Fournier, his young assistant, shifted uneasily near the doorway. "Sir, if it's poison, then perhaps he took it himself." Moreau exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Possible, but unlikely. A man like Émile Lemoine would have left a note. And besides," he gestured toward the victim's stiff hands, still curled as if grasping at something unseen. "Suicides do not die with such surprise on their faces." Fournier frowned, stepping further into the attic. His boots creaked against the floorboards, the sound unnerving in the quiet space. He hesitated before pointing toward the small writing desk pushed against the far wall. "That drawer. It's open just a crack." Moreau approached, his fingers tracing the brass handle before pulling it open fully. Inside lay a single sheet of paper with just one word hastily scrawled upon it: "Fraternité." The word sent an immediate chill down Moreau's spine. Brotherhood, or something more? The victim's past was no mystery. Lemoine had been an outspoken historian, known for unearthing long-buried secrets. Had one such secret cost him his life? A soft knock came from the attic door, and a uniformed officer entered, his face pale. "Inspector, Madame Lemoine is asking to see you. She's insistent." Moreau straightened. "Then we shall not keep her waiting." Downstairs, in the grand drawing-room, the widow sat stiffly upon a velvet settee. Clad in mourning black, she was the image of poise, but her fingers, long and delicate, twisted at the lace trim of her handkerchief. When she spoke, her voice was brittle. "You must find who did this." "I intend to," Moreau assured her. "Tell me, madame, was your husband behaving strangely before his death?" She hesitated, something flashing across her face before vanishing behind a practiced mask. "He was troubled." But Émile was always troubled. His work consumed him. "What work?" she exhaled, her gaze shifting toward the rain-speckled window. "He was writing a book, a history of a secret society, one he claimed still operated in the shadows. He said he had proof, documents, names, but he refused to let me see them." Moreau exchanged a glance with Fournier. A secret society, a historian murdered in a locked room, and a single cryptic word left behind. The puzzle was taking shape, but the solution remained just beyond reach. He turned back to the widow. "Do you know where he kept these documents?" She hesitated again. Then, slowly, she nodded. The attic. He always kept his notes there, in the false bottom of his desk drawer. Moreau's pulse quickened. If the murderer had come for those documents, had they taken them? Or had Emile hidden them somewhere else? Only one way to find out. With a curt nod, he rose to his feet. "Sergeant, we're going back upstairs." Moreau climbed the attic stairs once more, his mind sifting through the pieces of the puzzle like a jeweler examining a fractured gemstone. The facts were simple, yet maddeningly deceptive. Émile Lemoine, locked inside from within, dead by poison. A single word left behind: fraternité. A hidden collection of documents that might still be somewhere in this house. And then the widow, controlled, careful with her words, but beneath it all, something else. A hesitation, not of grief, but of calculation. The attic felt colder now, the rain drumming insistently on the roof above as Moreau moved toward the desk. Fournier followed, his notepad open, pencil poised. Moreau pulled out the drawer again, running his fingers along the base, tapping lightly until he found the hollow sound he was listening for. His pocket-knife slid easily into the groove, and with a sharp twist, the false bottom lifted. Marchand considered this, eyes flicking to the window. Still latched, no forced entry. If Brissot had let someone in, had he trusted them, or had he been too distracted to sense the danger? The key in his pocket suggested the former. He turned. To Madame Rousseau, the elderly woman wrapped in a heavy shawl, hands clutching the fabric like a lifeline. She had lived downstairs for years, knew Brissot's habits, the rhythm of his life. She had been the one to notice something was amiss. "You said the light was still on past midnight," Marchand said. "Was that unusual for him?" She nodded, quickly. "Léon worked late sometimes, but never all night. He always turned the lamp off before retiring. I remember because his footsteps on the floor would wake me even when he tried to be quiet." Marchand watched her carefully. "But you heard nothing last night?" Her fingers tightened in the fabric. "Nothing at all. It was only when the morning came and the light was still burning that I knew something was wrong. Strange. The act of murder was rarely silent. A struggle, even brief, left some trace of sound, furniture scraping, a gasp, a body hitting the floor. And yet Brissot had died without a whisper. Marchand glanced back at the strangled form. The rope was thick, used with precision. Not a crime of passion, but of control. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who had come prepared. He turned back to Madame Rousseau. "Did Brissot have visitors yesterday?" She hesitated, something flickering behind her eyes. Marchand let the silence stretch. Finally, she exhaled. "Yes. A man came by in the afternoon. I saw him from my window." Moreau perked up. "Did you recognize him?" She shook her head. "No, but he was well dressed, not like an artist. A long coat, leather gloves." Marchand nodded. "Did Brissot seem pleased to see him?" She hesitated again. I don't know. I only saw them speaking at the door, but Léon let him in." Marchand exchanged a glance with Moreau. A visitor Brissot hadn't expected, but one he hadn't turned away. That suggested familiarity, perhaps even obligation. He turned back to the studio, his eyes sweeping over the scattered brushes and palettes, the chaos of an artist's life, frozen mid-motion. And then something caught his attention, a faint smudge of red paint on the floor, near the body, separate from the rest. He crouched, inspecting it. Not just any red. Carmine, deep and rich, the same shade as the unfinished. Painting. Marchand's fingers traced the air just above the smear, his mind racing. The paint hadn't dried. It was fresh. And yet Brissot had been dead for hours. Marchand straightened slowly, his eyes lingering on the fresh smear of carmine. It was a small detail, but small details unravelled the tightest knots. He turned back to the unfinished portrait, the woman's face frozen in half-formed distress. The brushstrokes were deliberate. Brissot had painted her with purpose, and perhaps with urgency. But if the paint was still wet, had someone else touched it after his death? Had the killer lingered, their hands streaked with the very pigment that now stood as an unspoken signature? The thought gnawed at him as he stepped back toward Madame Rousseau. The old woman stood stiffly, her shawl clutched around her thin shoulders. Marchand studied her, not just her words, but the way she held them, as though weighing each one before, allowing it to leave her lips. "You said Brissot let the man in. Did you see when he left?" She hesitated, her fingers worrying at the fringe of her shawl. "No, I fell asleep before that." Marchand let the silence stretch between them. Again, watching the way she swallowed, her throat working over an unspoken truth. She was hiding something, but fear kept it lodged in her chest. Before he could press further, Moreau returned, a younger man in tow. He had the angular, drawn features of a man accustomed to hunger, though his clothes, paint-streaked and worn, at the elbows, suggested that the hunger was more for success than for food. His hands twitched as he stood before Marchand, his gaze darting toward Brissot's lifeless form and quickly away again. "This is Henri Latour," Moreau said, "Brissot's friend, another painter." Marchand nodded, watching how Latour's fingers clenched and unclenched, as if grasping for something unseen. "You knew Brissot well?" Latour's lips pressed together for a moment before he nodded. "We studied together at the Académie. He was talented." His voice wavered slightly. "Better than most. Better than you," Marchand thought, but he didn't voice it. Envy was a sharp chisel, capable of carving deep wounds. "When did you last see him?" Marchand asked. Latour exhaled, shaking his head. "2 nights ago." He was working on that. His gaze flicked toward the unfinished portrait. "I was here late. We drank some wine. Talked." Marchand tilted his head. "And last night?" Latour shook his head quickly. "No, I wasn't here." "Where were you?" "At Le Chat Noir." The answer came swiftly, too swiftly. Marchand let the moment settle. "All night?" "Yes. Ask anyone." Again, too quick. Moreau cleared his throat. "We will." Latour's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Marchand let his gaze drift back to the body, then to the fresh smear of carmine. Did Brissot often paint late into the night? Latour hesitated. "Sometimes." Marchand turned fully toward him, hands in his pockets. "Did he ever speak of someone? A patron, perhaps? A buyer?" Latour swallowed. "There was someone. A collector. Jules Vernet." Marchand's brow lifted slightly. "Vernet?" "Yes. He was interested in Brissot's work. They met a few times." Marchand nodded, filing the name away. "And this visitor yesterday? A well-dressed man? Would Vernet fit that description?" Latour tensed, his fingers twitching again. "Maybe. I don't know." Marchand held his gaze, watching for cracks. Latour's story held, but there were fractures along the edges. Fear, guilt, something simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you, Monsieur Latour," Marchand said, voice even. "Don't leave Montmartre," Latour nodded stiffly, turning to go. But as he passed the unfinished painting, his gaze lingered for just a second too long. Marchand saw it, the flicker of something unreadable. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. When the door closed behind him, Marchand turned back to Moreau. "Fine, Vernet." Moreau nodded, already moving. Marchand stepped toward the portrait once more, staring into the woman's half-formed expression. Brissot had tried to capture something important, and someone had killed him before he could finish. Marchand stood in the dim studio, the weight of the case settling onto his shoulders like the damp Parisian air pressing through the narrow Montmartre streets. The pieces were scattered. An artist strangled in a locked room, a mysterious key, a visitor no one could place, and a painting that seemed to scream a message only Brissot had understood. But the picture was still incomplete, its brushstrokes blurred by deception. Moreau returned before long, shaking his head. "Jules Vernet is a known collector, but he's not the kind to haunt backstreet studios himself. He buys through intermediaries, dealers, gallery owners." No record of him meeting Brissot personally. Marchand considered this. And yet Latour claimed they met. Maybe Latour was mistaken. Moreau's voice carried doubt. Or maybe he wasn't. Marchand tapped a finger against his chin. Either Vernet had business here he preferred to keep quiet, or someone used his name. Moreau frowned. A collector's reputation is everything. If Vernet wanted Brissot's work, why lie about
it? Because it wasn't about art. Marchand's eyes drifted once more to the half-finished portrait. It was about something else. They needed more. Brissot's world was small, but the ripples of his murder stretched wider than
they had first assumed. Marchand decided it was time to stir the waters. By midday, he found himself in the salon of Madame Léonie Duval, a wealthy patroness of the arts with a fondness for young, struggling painters. Her home was draped in heavy silk curtains, her fingers adorned with rings that clicked together as she gestured. She regarded him with mild amusement as he stood before her, hands in his coat pockets, his sharp gaze dissecting the opulence surrounding them. "Inspector, I do admire a man with purpose," she said, voice rich with amusement. "Tell me, how may I assist you?" Léon Brissot, Marchand said, watching her reaction. A pause, a slight tilt of the head. "A tragic loss," she said lightly. "Such promise. His work was
raw, but there was something in it, something almost desperate. Were you one of his buyers?" A slight smile. "I have many artists in my collection." "But Brissot wasn't just an artist," Marchand said. "He had something people wanted. Something worth lying for." She met his gaze, something cold flickering beneath the surface. "And you believe I am one of those people?" "I believe that money and influence can buy many things, madame," Marchand said smoothly.
"And that people like Brissot are often caught in the spaces between ambition and desperation." She studied him for a long moment before sighing, reclining against the divan. "He came to me some weeks ago, in need of funds. I refused him." "Why?" Smirked. "He was talented, Inspector, but talent alone does not guarantee investment." He lacked restraint. His paintings had a certain fever to them. He was chasing something. Marchand nodded toward the grand collection of paintings hanging along her walls. "Chasing what?" A shadow crossed her face, brief but unmistakable.
"That I do not know." But she did. Marchand could feel it. She had seen something in Brissot, something valuable, perhaps dangerous, and she had stepped away. As he left, Moreau fell into step beside him.
She's hiding something. They all are, Marchand murmured. And yet none of their motives explain the locked room. They had spoken to neighbours, friends, rivals. Brissot had debts, yes, but not enough to warrant murder. He had talent, but not enough to breed the kind of obsession that left a man strangled in his own home. He had fear, that much was certain. But fear of what? Marchand's hand slipped into his pocket, his fingers grazing the brass key. It still had no door, no home. A detail waiting to make sense. Then Moreau's voice broke his thoughts. "Inspector, we found Vernet." Jules Vernet was not the kind of man who enjoyed being summoned by the police. He arrived at the station, with an air of irritation, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine tailored coat, as though he had been called away from far more important matters. He sat stiffly across from Marchand, his expression carefully neutral. "I fail to see why I am here," Vernet said. "I never met this Brissot." "Strange," Marchand said, watching him closely. "Because he told others he had met you." Vernet scoffed. "Artists are known for embellishment. And yet, someone using your name was in his studio the day he died." That struck a nerve. Vernet's jaw tightened. "That is absurd." Marchand leaned forward. "Tell me, Monsieur Vernet, if you did not want Brissot's work, did you want something else?" Vernet's fingers flexed. "I have no idea what you mean." Marchand studied him. Wealthy men often thought themselves untouchable. But guilt was not as easy to hide as money. He let the silence stretch before dropping his final stroke. Brissot was afraid his last work was unfinished, and someone killed him before he could finish telling his story. Vernet exhaled sharply, standing. "I have nothing more to say." But Marchand knew then that he had struck at something true. The web was tightening. Now he just needed to find the thread that would unravel it completely. Moreau's voice carried a triumphant edge as he strode into the office, the crisp morning light casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. "We have him," he declared, tossing a folded report onto Marchand's desk. "Henri Latour. He was seen near Brissot's studio the night of the murder. A witness claims he heard arguing, and we found this in his apartment." Marchand unfolded the paper, revealing a photograph of a crumpled rag streaked with crimson paint, the same carmine Brissot had been using on his unfinished portrait. "It's a match," Moreau continued. "Forensics confirmed it came from Brissot's palette. Latour must have touched the painting before he left." He leaned in, his expression taut with certainty. "We bring him in now and the case is closed." Marchand studied the evidence, his fingers grazing the edge of the paper. It was too neat, too easy. Latour was jealous of Brissot's success, that much was clear. He had lied about his whereabouts, and now there was physical proof linking him to the studio. It was the kind of case the department would love, straightforward, clean. Yet something gnawed at Marchand, a whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be silenced. He pushed back his chair, rising to his feet. "Let's talk to him." The interrogation room was stark and silent, the only sound the quiet creak of the wooden chair as Latour shifted uncomfortably. His face was drawn, his eyes darting between Marchand and Moreau as they entered. He had the look of a man who knew. The noose was tightening. "I don't understand," Latour said, his voice cracking slightly.
"I've already told you I wasn't there that night." Marchand laid the photograph on the table before him. "Then how do you explain this?" Latour's fingers twitched, his throat working over a hard swallow. I don't know. I
Helped Brissot clean his brushes 2 nights ago. Maybe I got paint on me then, Moreau scoffed. Convenient excuse? Latour's head snapped up, frustration flickering in his eyes. Why would I kill Brissot? He was my friend. Marchand studied him carefully. You were seen near his studio, Latour hesitated. I went by, yes, but I didn't go inside. He cut himself off, his hands gripping the table. You what? Marchand pressed. Latour exhaled sharply. I saw someone else go in, a man in a dark coat. I didn't recognize him, but I heard voices. He shook his head. Brissot was arguing with someone. Moreau exchanged a glance with Marchand, unimpressed. And you didn't think to mention this before? I was scared, Latour admitted. I knew how it would look. I knew you'd think it was me. Marchand leaned back slightly, tapping a finger against his chin. Latour's story wasn't airtight, but there was something raw in his voice, something desperate, yes, but not the desperation of a guilty man trying to weave a lie. Moreau, however, was less convinced. We have enough, he said, pushing back from the table. We charge him, and this case is done. Marchand remained seated, his gaze locked onto Latour. The pieces didn't fit. The key in Brissot's pocket, the unfinished painting, the patron with secrets, and the mention of Jules Vernet, none of it pointed cleanly to Latour. If anything, it pointed to something deeper. He stood abruptly. No, Moreau turned, incredulous. No! This isn't right, Marchand said. It's a frame, Moreau sighed. Marchand! He's not our man, Marchand insisted. Someone planted that paint-streaked rag to send us in the wrong direction, Rowe pinched the bridge of his nose. And who would do that? Marchand exhaled, his thoughts racing. Someone who needed time, someone who knew we'd jump at the easiest answer. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then Moreau muttered, If you're wrong, the department will have your head. Marchand only nodded. Then I suppose I can't afford to be wrong. He turned back to Latour. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you saw. Latour exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to force clarity from the chaos in his mind. I told you I was outside. I didn't see his face. Just a dark coat, a shadow moving through the doorway. Then voices. The argument didn't last long, maybe a minute or two. Then silence. His hands curled into fists on the table.
I should have stayed. I should have... Marchand lifted a hand, silencing him. Something clicked in his mind, a puzzle piece sliding into place. A minute or two, he repeated softly. Not long enough for a struggle? Not long enough for a murder? Moreau frowned. So what?
You think someone else came in afterward? Marchand's fingers drummed against the tabletop. Or the killer was already there? Latour's eyes flickered with uncertainty. What does that mean? Marchand didn't answer. Instead, he turned, sharply on his heel, striding out of the interrogation room and back into the dim corridors of the station. His thoughts raced, unraveling threads he hadn't yet known existed. The crime had been messy, but the setup, the planted evidence, the convenient witnesses, the almost too perfect suspect, was too well constructed. Someone had designed this chaos, using deception as their brushstroke. He needed to go back, not to the scene, but to something deeper. By the time he and Moreau reached the archives, the room was empty, save for dust, and the faint hum of the overhead lamps. Marchand moved quickly, his fingers running along the old case files stacked against the shelves. Moreau crossed his arms. This isn't like you, Marchand. You never chase ghosts. Maybe because I never noticed they were standing in plain sight before, Marchand murmured, pulling a thick, yellowed folder from the stacks. He opened it with careful hands, scanning the neatly typed lines. Then he froze. The name leapt from the page like a spectre from the past. Jules Vernet, associated with multiple fraud cases, suspected of art smuggling. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence. Moreau peered over his shoulder. Vernet? His voice was incredulous. The collector? Marchand nodded slowly. Brissot was afraid before he died. He knew something, maybe something about Vernet's past. He flipped to another page, his brow furrowing as he traced a familiar name. And here, look at this. He tapped the paper. Henri Latour. Moreau stiffened. No, that doesn't make sense. Marchand's pulse quickened. The link had been in front of them the whole time, buried beneath years of dust. 15 years ago, there was an art fraud investigation involving forged paintings. Vernet was suspected of running the operation, but they could never prove his involvement. The forger was a young artist, Henri Latour. Moreau let out a slow breath. So they knew each other. More than that. Marchand's mind raced. Latour was never convicted, but his career never recovered. If Brissot discovered something, some evidence of what really happened back then, Vernet would have wanted it buried. Moreau ran a hand through his hair. That means Vernet
isn't just involved, he's the one pulling the strings, Marchand nodded grimly.
And he framed Latour to clean up his mess. But something still didn't sit right. Brissot had been killed for what he knew, that much was clear. But why now? What had he uncovered that forced Vernet to act after all these years? Marchand closed the file, the weight of history pressing down on him. There was still a missing piece, one last stroke needed to complete the picture, and he knew exactly where to find it. Marchand felt the weight of the past pressing against him as he walked through the dimly lit corridors of the station. The discovery in the archives had shifted everything. The murder of Brissot wasn't a crime of passion, nor a simple rivalry turned deadly. It was a calculated act tied to an old deception, and Jules Vernet was at the center of it. He needed to get Vernet to slip. The man was too careful, too practiced in his manipulations. A direct accusation wouldn't work. Vernet would deflect, weave another layer of lies. Marchand had to make him believe the truth had already surfaced. A suspect who thinks the game is lost often reveals more in desperation than under direct scrutiny. By the time he and Moreau arrived at Vernet's grand residence on the Rue de Lille, the evening was pressing in, the city's hum settling into quiet anticipation. The butler hesitated at the door, his eyes flickering with something Marchand immediately recognized, an awareness that trouble had arrived. Vernet received them in his private study, a cavernous room lined with paintings that bore the weight of stolen history. His expression remained neutral, but his grip on the armrest of his leather chair tightened ever so slightly as Marchand took a seat opposite him. "Inspecteur," Vernet said smoothly, folding his hands. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Marchand let a measured silence stretch between them before speaking. "We found something interesting, Monsieur Vernet."
Something from the past. Vernet's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker, almost imperceptible, in his gaze.
"The past, you say?" How intriguing. Marchand leaned forward. Brissot's murder wasn't just about the present. It was about something buried. Something you were involved in years ago. Vernet exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Inspecteur, I don't deal in the past, only in what is valuable now." Marchand placed the old case file on the table between them, tapping his fingers lightly against its worn cover. I think Brissot uncovered evidence of your involvement in the forgery ring. I think he was going to expose you. Vernet's expression remained composed, but Marchand noticed his fingers flexing slightly against the armrest. A small, unconscious
movement, one that betrayed the steady current of thought running beneath his polished exterior. "But you see, Vernet," Marchand continued, "what surprises me most is not that Brissot was on to you.
It's how he found out." He let the words hang, watching for a reaction. Vernet finally exhaled, shaking his head. "You're chasing ghosts, Inspector. If you had anything substantial, you wouldn't be here trying to unsettle me." Marchand smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I did find something Brissot was working on before his death." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. A close-up of Brissot's final painting, the one that had been left unfinished on the easel the night
of his murder. Vernet's gaze flickered to it, and in that fraction of a second, Marchand saw it. The slightest dilation of the pupils, the quick inhalation, recognition. He knew what he was looking at. Marchand set the photo on the table.
"I believe you've seen this before." Vernet took a slow breath. "An unfinished work. What of it?" Marchand tilted his head. "That's what I wondered at first. Why did Brissot leave it half-completed? Then I looked closer." He pointed to a seemingly insignificant detail, a faint, nearly imperceptible signature painted in the background. Not Brissot's. A different hand entirely. Moreau, standing behind Marchand, crossed his arms. "A forgery," he said, his voice carrying a weight Vernet couldn't ignore. "But a clever one, buried within the real work of a master." Marchand's gaze didn't leave Vernet. "Brissot found one of your forgeries, didn't he? Not just any forgery. One that proved everything. And he hid it, incorporated it into his own painting. An artist's way of leaving a message." Vernet's fingers finally stilled. His breathing had changed, shallower now. "A fascinating theory," he said softly, though his voice carried the brittle edge of someone recalculating his escape route. Marchand nodded toward the photograph. "What's more fascinating is that you recognized it immediately. You didn't
need me to explain what you were looking at, because you already knew."
A moment of charged silence stretched between them. Then Vernet laughed, low and measured, shaking his head. "You're quite the dramatist, Inspector." His voice was smooth, but Marchand could see the fracture widening beneath the surface. "You didn't just kill Brissot to silence him," Marchand pressed. "You needed time. You needed to find out whether he had told anyone, whether he had hidden something else." Vernet's smile was gone now. His mask was slipping, revealing the controlled calculation underneath. "And if I were to entertain this absurd theory of yours, what would come next?" Marchand stood, sliding the photograph back into his pocket. "You already know the answer to that." Vernet didn't move, but Marchand caught the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest again, barely perceptible, but enough. He was thinking, weighing his options, and that meant only one thing. He wasn't finished playing his hand. Marchand barely had time to process the tension in Vernet's eyes before his phone buzzed in his pocket. He retrieved it, glancing at the message from Moreau's contact at the evidence lockup. 2 words, stark and urgent.
"It's gone." His heartbeat kicked up. He stepped back from Vernet, his mind racing. "Excuse me for a moment," he murmured, turning toward the door as Moreau followed close behind. They exited into the hallway, and Marchand's voice dropped to a
sharp whisper. "What do you mean it's gone?" Moreau's jaw tightened. "The painting. The unfinished one. It was taken from the evidence room an hour ago." Marchand felt the weight of the words settle over him like a noose tightening. The only irrefutable proof tying Vernet to the murder vanished. Someone had anticipated their move. "Inside job?" he asked. Moreau nodded grimly. No signs of forced entry. The security footage was wiped clean for that section of the station. Marchand exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He had known the moment Vernet's composure slipped that the man wasn't done playing his hand. Now the proof was gone, and any hope of cornering him cleanly had been severed. They re-entered the study, and Vernet was still in his chair, fingers now lazily tapping the armrest, a faint smirk playing at his lips. He had received word. "He knew. Problem, Inspector?" he asked, voice light, almost amused. Marchand studied him. Vernet was a man who believed in control of his reputation, his legacy, and now, clearly, the narrative of this case. If he had arranged for the theft of the painting, it meant he was willing to go to great lengths to erase his connection to Brissot's murder. Moreau's fists clenched at his sides, but Marchand placed a hand on his arm, a silent signal to hold back. There was no point in reacting now. Vernet was waiting for that, to see them falter, to watch them scramble. Marchand forced a small smile. "No problem at all," he said evenly. "Just another delay." Vernet's smirk twitched slightly, as if debating whether to gloat, but Marchand saw something else there, a flicker of something deeper beneath his arrogance. Doubt? Vernet wasn't sure if getting rid of the painting had been enough. That meant he had missed something. Marchand straightened, buttoning his coat. "Well, Monsieur Vernet, I appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll speak again very soon." Vernet inclined his head, watching them closely. "Looking forward to it, Inspector." They left the residence, stepping onto the street where the night had fully settled over Paris. The gas lamps cast long shadows, stretching down the cobblestones like reaching fingers. "We're back to nothing," Moreau muttered under his breath. Marchand shook his head. "Not nothing. He's afraid, Moreau. He wouldn't have gone to such extremes if he believed we had nothing else." Moreau frowned. "But what do we have?" Marchand's mind reeled through the details. The painting had been their strongest evidence, but not their only lead. Brissot had hidden the signature in his work for a reason. Was there something else he had left behind? A message? Another clue? Then he remembered something. Brissot's studio. He turned to Moreau. "We need to get back to Brissot's studio, now." They drove through the quiet streets, urgency laced in every turn of the wheels. Marchand's instincts clawed at him. The painting had been removed, but Vernet couldn't have known everything Brissot might have left behind. When they arrived, the studio was dark and untouched since their last visit. They unlocked the door, stepping into the silent space where Brissot had spent his final hours. The air was thick with turpentine and the faint remnants of linseed oil. The canvas had been taken, but the rest of his work remained. Marchand moved quickly, scanning the room. The walls were lined with sketches, early drafts of paintings, color studies. Nothing stood out. Then Moreau spoke. "Marchand, the easel." Marchand turned. The wooden easel, where the final painting had once rested, had faint streaks of paint still dried into its frame. But something else caught his eye, thin scratches, almost invisible, carved into the lower beam of the easel. He crouched, running his fingers over the marks. They weren't accidental, they were letters, a message, not the last. His breath caught. Brissot had anticipated this. He knew the painting might not survive, and he had left something behind, something Vernet hadn't accounted for. Marchand stood sharply. Brissot made more than one painting. Moreau's eyes widened. A duplicate? Or another hidden clue, Marchand said. But it means we still have a chance. Moreau nodded, determination returning to his face. Then we find it before Vernet does. The game had shifted once more. And this time, Marchand had no intention of losing. Marchand barely had time to process the weight of Brissot's message before his phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen, an unknown number. His instincts flared. He answered, keeping his voice steady. Marchand. There was no greeting, just a sharp intake of breath, then a voice, strained, hurried. You're looking in the wrong place. Marchand stiffened. Who is this?
You need to... A muffled sound, like the phone being snatched away, then a sharp clatter. The line cut off. Moreau, who had been rifling through Brissot's sketches, turned at the change in Marchand's expression. What is it? Marchand replayed.
The words in his head. The voice had been male, slightly raspy, someone nervous, speaking fast, like they knew time was running out. A warning, he muttered. Someone else is involved in this. Moreau frowned. Could be a trap. Or someone trying to get out before it's too late, Marchand said. The feeling in his gut tightened. They were close, too close. Someone wanted them to stop before they uncovered the next step in Brissot's trail. Then his phone rang again. This time it was from the precinct. Marchand answered. Go ahead. Lieutenant Charpentier's voice was tense. We have a problem, Inspector. Another. Body. The words sent a chill through him. Who? Charpentier hesitated. Pierre Arnaud, found in his apartment, strangled, same method as Brissot. Arnaud. Marchand felt his pulse quicken. The gallery owner. The man who had been too eager to distance himself from Vernet, who had claimed
ignorance about Brissot's hidden signature. Someone had silenced him. Moreau swore under his breath. Vernet's tying off loose ends. Marchand nodded, already moving. And we're running out of time. They drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. Arnaud had been nervous when they last spoke to him, but Marchand hadn't considered him
to be in immediate danger. Now he was another casualty in a case spiraling into something larger than they had first believed. When they arrived at Arnaud's apartment, the crime scene was already secured. Officers lingered in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones. Charpentier met them at the door, his expression grim. No sign of forced entry, he said. Whoever did this, Arnaud let them in. Marchand stepped inside, immediately struck by the eerie familiarity of the scene. The body slumped over the desk, the slight bruising around the neck, the stiff fingers curled in death. It mirrored Brissot's final moments too closely. A deliberate echo, a message. He scanned the room. Unlike Brissot's studio, there were no signs of struggle, no unfinished painting to serve as a cryptic clue. But Arnaud hadn't been killed at random. He had known something worth killing for. Marchand's gaze landed on the desk. Papers had been swept aside, as if Arnaud had been searching for something before he died. And then, a torn corner of canvas just barely peeking out from underneath a stack of invoices. Marchand strode forward, lifting the papers. It was a scrap of a painting, just a fragment, but it was enough. Moreau leaned in. That's Brissot's style, Marchand nodded. The colours, the brush strokes, it was unmistakable, But this wasn't from the stolen painting. This was something else. "He had another piece," Marchand said, "and someone knew he had it." Moreau's expression darkened. "And now it's missing." Marchand turned to Charpentier. "Was anything else taken?" Charpentier shook his head. "No valuables missing. Nothing else seems disturbed. Whoever did this, they came for one thing." Marchand clenched his jaw. "The second painting, Brissot's real message, was gone. Vernet, or whoever was pulling the strings, had beaten them to it. But then why kill Arnaud?" Moreau voiced the thought. "If they got what they wanted, why not just leave?"
Why risk another murder? Marchand's eyes narrowed as he considered it. There was only one reason. Because Arnaud knew something else, he said. Something that wasn't in the painting. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. One of the officers stepped inside, looking uncertain. "Inspector, there's someone here asking for you," Marchand frowned. "Who?" The officer shifted. "They wouldn't give their name, just said you'd want to hear what they have to say." Marchand and Moreau exchanged a glance before following.
The officer outside, a figure stood in the hallway, hood drawn up, hands buried deep in their coat pockets. As they turned, Marchand recognized the face instantly. Camille Girard, Brissot's former assistant, the woman who had disappeared after his death. Moreau stiffened. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here now." Camille's eyes darted between them, full of tension, but there was no defiance in her expression, only fear. "I didn't kill him," she said, voice low. "But I know who did." Marchand studied her carefully. "Then start talking." She swallowed hard. "Not here. They're watching." Fresh wave of unease rolled through Marchand. "Who?" Camille's fingers twitched at her sides. "Vernet isn't the one you should be worried about," she whispered. "He's just a puppet." Marchand's blood went cold. Before he could press her further, the light in the hallway flickered. Just once, barely noticeable. Camille's eyes widened. She took a step back, shaking her head. "No!" A loud crack split the air. A single gunshot. Camille jerked, a red bloom spreading across her coat. She staggered, eyes wild with shock, before collapsing. "Camille!" Marchand lunged forward, catching her as she hit the floor. Moreau was already drawing his weapon, scanning the corridor for the shooter. But they were too late. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Whoever had silenced Camille had already vanished into the night. Marchand gritted his teeth, pressing against the wound. Camille gasped, her fingers clutching at his coat. Blood smeared across his hands. "Who?" he urged. "Who's behind this?" She struggled to breathe, her lips forming a single word. Soft, barely audible. Then her eyes went still. The hallway was deathly silent. Moreau swore, slamming his fist against the wall. "Damn it!" Marchand sat back, his mind racing. Camille had known the truth, had risked everything to tell them, and now she was gone, but she had given them something. That last word, whispered in her final breath, a name, and Marchand would make sure it wasn't spoken in vain. Marchand's hands were still slick with Camille's blood when Moreau crouched beside him, his face grim. The hallway felt too quiet. Now, the chaos of the gunshot leaving behind an unnatural stillness. Camille's final breath had left him with nothing but a name, soft, broken, almost lost. "Did you hear what she said?" Moreau's voice was low, urgent. Marchand swallowed, forcing himself to replay the moment. The way her lips had shaped the word, the faint whisper carried on dying breath. It had been fleeting, but unmistakable. "Delacroix," he murmured. Moreau's brow furrowed. That name again. They had come across it before, once in Brissot's hidden notes, then again in the tangled whispers of the art world's underbelly. But nothing concrete had ever tied it to the murders. Until now, Marchand stood, jaw tight. Whoever Delacroix is, they're not done yet. Moreau glanced down at Camille's lifeless body. We need to move fast. If she knew enough to get herself killed, then there's more we haven't seen. The precinct would send in their team soon, but Marchand couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. They needed to find Delacroix before the name became just another echo in a string of unsolved deaths. He exhaled sharply. We go back to Brissot's notes. There's something we missed, something that ties him, Vernet, and Arnaud together, straight to Delacroix. Moreau nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll have Brissot's files pulled again, and I'll put out a quiet inquiry for Delacroix. Someone in the network has to know something. Marchand barely heard him. His mind was already moving, tracing the connections, the missing pieces snapping into place. Camille had risked everything to give them a name. Now it was up to him to make sure it meant something. Marchand stared at the name written in Brissot's
notes, his fingers pressing against the paper as if he could force it to yield more than ink. Delacroix. It had been a whisper in the background of their investigation, an afterthought, a footnote in the tangled web of deception.
But Camille's dying breath had given it weight, had made it real. Moreau paced behind him, his boots scuffing the worn wooden floor of the archive room. Delacroix doesn't show up in any official records. No birth certificate, no tax filings, nothing. It's like they don't exist. Marchand exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. They exist, but not as a person. Moreau stopped. What do you mean? Marchand tapped the paper. Brissot wasn't referencing Delacroix as an individual. It's a pseudonym, an identity used to shield someone else, someone who has been orchestrating this entire mess from the beginning. Moreau leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Who? Marchand flipped back through the notes, his mind working through the details. The stolen paintings, the staged suicides, the precision of each crime. It had all seemed like a battle over money, influence, or revenge, but something had never quite fit. The motive isn't greed, Marchand said finally, or even power. It's something deeper. Moreau frowned. Then what? Marchand turned another page, his eyes catching on a series of numbers scrawled in the margins. He recognized them instantly. Coordinates, a location hidden in plain sight. And suddenly everything clicked. This was never about the paintings themselves, he murmured. It was about what was hidden inside them. Moreau's breath hitched. Smuggling? Not just smuggling, Marchand said, shaking his head. Secrets, information, messages hidden in the layers of paint, in the brushstrokes, a code embedded in the art itself. Moreau stared at him. You're saying this wasn't about money, it was espionage? Marchand nodded. Brissot was part of something much larger than we realized, and whoever Delacroix really is, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of revelation. This wasn't just a case of
murder. It was something far more dangerous, and they were running out of time to stop it. Marchand watched the dim glow of the street lamp flicker against the wet pavement, his breath steady despite the cold bite of the night air.
The Seine moved sluggishly behind him, its dark waters reflecting the city's restless energy. Across the street, the old gallery stood silent, its once grand façade shadowed by time and secrecy. Inside, Delacroix was waiting. Moreau adjusted, his grip on the small recording device in his pocket, his expression unreadable. Are you sure about this? Marchand nodded. They think they still have control. That's what makes them vulnerable. Everything had led to this moment. The stolen paintings, the carefully orchestrated murders, the cryptic messages hidden beneath layers of paint. Brissot had uncovered the truth before he died, and Camille had given her life to point them in the right direction. Now Marchand was here to finish it. A shadow moved behind the gallery's glass door. Marchand exhaled, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside. The air smelled of varnish and aged wood. The high ceilings amplified the faint echo of his footsteps as he walked past rows of covered canvases, relics of a forgotten era. And then, at the far end of the room, a lone figure stood waiting, Delacroix. They were older than he expected there, but sharp, patrician features, softened only by the weight of time. They watched him with an expression of quiet amusement, as if this meeting had been inevitable. "Detective Marchand," Delacroix said smoothly. "You've been quite persistent." Marchand stopped a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides. "I don't like loose ends." Delacroix tilted their head. "Neither do I." For a moment, neither of them moved. The gallery's silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Marchand took a slow step forward. "You killed Brissot because he got too close," he said, "and Vernet because he started asking the wrong questions. Arnaud was collateral damage, and Camille—" His jaw tightened. "She figured it out, didn't she? That the paintings weren't just stolen for their worth. They were messages." Delacroix smiled faintly. "I should have destroyed them sooner." "Wouldn't have mattered," Marchand said. Brissot kept records. He was meticulous. He knew this wasn't just an art smuggling ring. He knew these paintings held classified information, encoded messages meant for someone else. He let the words settle before continuing. "Who were you working for?" Delacroix chuckled softly. "You think I'd tell you?" Marchand's eyes stayed locked on them. "I think you already have." Moreau moved before Delacroix did, stepping from the shadows at the gallery's entrance, gun drawn. Delacroix's amusement flickered for just a second before they sighed, glancing toward the door. "I suppose I underestimated you," they admitted. Marchand's voice was steady. "That makes two of us." For the first time, Delacroix looked truly cornered. The weight of years spent controlling the game had finally come crashing down. "You could still walk out of here alive," Marchand said, "or you could make a mistake." Delacroix's hand twitched near their coat pocket, but Moreau was faster. The sharp click of a safety being disengaged cut through the room, halting them in place. "That's not the right choice," Moreau murmured. Delacroix let out a quiet laugh, raising their hands in surrender. "I suppose not." Marchand exhaled, his grip finally easing. The chase was over. But as he looked at the remnants of a once meticulously hidden operation, he knew this was only the beginning. Someone else was still out there, waiting for the messages. Delacroix would never deliver, and Marchand had every intention of finding them. Marchand watched as Delacroix was escorted out of the gallery, their usual composure fractured, but not broken. They had lost, but Marchand knew better than to mistake that for defeat. People like Delacroix always had contingencies, hidden moves no one saw coming until it was too late. Moreau lingered by the door, arms crossed. "That was too easy," he muttered. Marchand didn't disagree. Something gnawed at him, a quiet dissonance beneath the victory. The case had wrapped up too neatly, every answer falling into place as if arranged by an unseen hand. He turned back toward the room, eyes scanning the cupboard. Canvases, the dust settling over forgotten history. The paintings had been coded messages, carrying secrets worth killing for. Delacroix had played their part, but were they truly the architect of it all? He walked to a painting, still uncovered, a 19th-century piece depicting a quiet Parisian street, its brushstrokes delicate, intentional. Camille had been fascinated by this one. Before she died, she had circled it in Brissot's notes. Marchand frowned. Something felt wrong. Then he saw it. Not in the painting itself, but in the frame. A subtle misalignment, a barely perceptible shift in the wood. His fingers brushed against the edge, pressing gently until he felt movement. A hidden compartment. Moreau stepped closer. "What is it?" Marchand didn't answer. He carefully pried open the section, revealing a slim, folded document inside. The paper was aged, delicate. His breath caught as he unfolded it, the symbols and numbers instantly recognizable. It wasn't just another coded message, it was a name that shouldn't have been here. Moreau's voice was quiet. "No, that's not possible." Marchand's pulse pounded. Delacroix had been a player in this game, but they weren't the one pulling the strings. The real mastermind had been hiding in plain sight, and they had just let them walk away. Marchand stared at the name on the document, the letters sinking into his mind like ink spreading on damp paper. It wasn't Delacroix. It had never been Delacroix. The true puppet master had been someone else all along, someone who had woven their influence so deeply into the case that Marchand hadn't even considered them a suspect. Moreau leaned over his shoulder, his breath sharp with disbelief.
I have to stop them." Marchand didn't hesitate. He bolted for the door, pushing past the lingering officers still congratulating themselves on a closed case.
Delacroix had been their perfect villain, arrogant, shrewd, and just guilty enough. But the real culprit had let Delacroix take the fall, orchestrating every move from the shadows. The hallway stretched endlessly as he ran, his mind racing through. Every conversation, every moment that had felt off but hadn't seemed important at the time. The way Camille had hesitated before speaking about Brissot. The way the curator had deflected when asked about certain paintings. The misplaced ledger. The missing dates. And then the final clue. The one he had missed until now. The street outside was cold, the Parisian night thick with mist. Moreau was already signalling for a patrol car, barking orders at a confused officer. Marchand knew where they needed to go. "The docks," he said, barely pausing for breath. "Hurry! The car's—" Tires screeched as they sped through narrow streets, weaving between traffic. The Seine glistened under the moonlight as they neared the warehouses, a secluded district where deals were made in the dark and secrets were buried beneath the water. Marchand spotted a figure ahead, moving toward a waiting boat. Even from a distance, he recognized the careful, deliberate stride. The true mastermind. Marchand stepped out of the car, calling out. "You played us well." The figure turned, their face composed, betraying no fear. "Did I?" Marchand held up the document. "Your signature, hidden in plain sight." A soft smile. "And yet here I am, still free." Moreau moved forward, but Marchand lifted a hand. This wasn't about brute force. The truth had already won. The real question was whether justice would follow. "The paintings weren't just coded messages," Marchand said. "They were a map, a guide to something far bigger than Brissot's secrets." A pause, a flicker of something unreadable in their expression. "You knew we'd chase." "Delacroix," Marchand continued. "You gave us just enough to believe the case was solved, and when we arrested them you walked away, unseen, unbothered. A slow nod. But you still don't understand why. Marchand narrowed his eyes. Enlighten me. The mastermind took a step closer, their voice barely above a whisper. Power, detective. Not money, not revenge. Power. The kind that doesn't make headlines but moves history. A siren wailed in the distance. Footsteps, backup arriving. For the first time, a shadow of disappointment crossed their face. Marchand exhaled. It's over. The mastermind studied him for a long moment, then, with a resigned smile, held out their wrists. Is it? The cuffs clicked into place. And yet, as they were led away, Marchand couldn't shake the feeling that he had only uncovered a fraction of the truth, that somewhere in the shadows of Paris another story was already beginning. Marchand stood by the Seine, the waters reflecting the flickering streetlights, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his trench coat. The city had settled into its usual rhythm, indifferent to the storm that had just passed. The mastermind was in custody. The case was closed. Justice, if that's what it could be called, had been served. And yet, something in his gut refused to quiet. Moreau approached, his breath visible in the crisp night air. You did it, he said, nudging Marchand's shoulder. Drink to celebrate? Marchand didn't answer right away. His fingers curled. Around the crumpled document in his pocket, the signature that had unraveled everything. Go ahead, he muttered. I'll catch up. Moreau hesitated, then shrugged. Suit yourself. His footsteps faded into the distance. Marchand turned back to the water. He replayed the final conversation with the mastermind, their calculated words lingering like an unfinished sentence. Is it? That wasn't defiance. It was something else. A whisper of something unresolved. He pulled out his cigarette case, flipping it open absently. And that's when he saw it. A folded slip of paper tucked inside where it hadn't been before. His pulse quickened as he unfolded it, revealing a single line of elegant script. The game never ends. Look closer. His mind raced. The message hadn't been there an hour ago. Someone had placed it, someone who had access, someone still watching. Marchand's eyes lifted to the streets around him, scanning the faces in the crowd. A passerby turned, away too quickly. A figure in a dark coat slipped into an alley. The case wasn't over. Not really, and whoever had left that message was already 3 steps ahead.